There are certain moments in life that feel inevitable, as though fate itself has whispered a secret into the darkness. For most of us, death remains shrouded in mystery, arriving without warning and leaving only questions in its wake. But throughout history, there have been those who seem to possess an inexplicable knowledge about their final moments, people who spoke with eerie certainty about when and how they would die. Some made calculated predictions based on patterns they observed. Others experienced visions or dreams that proved disturbingly accurate. Whether through mathematics, mysticism, or an unexplainable sixth sense, these individuals peered through the veil between life and death and saw what awaited them on the other side. These are their stories. In the annals of mathematical history, few figures are as fascinating as Abraham de Moivre, a French mathematician who made groundbreaking contributions to probability theory and analytic geometry during the 18th century. Born in the spring of 1667 in Vitry-le-François, France, de Moivre's life was marked by religious persecution and intellectual brilliance in equal measure. As a Protestant in predominantly Catholic France, his faith became both his identity and his burden. When King Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, effectively stripping Protestants of their religious freedom, de Moivre found himself imprisoned for his beliefs. The exact duration of his imprisonment remains disputed among historians, with some accounts suggesting he was released relatively quickly, while others claim he spent years confined within abbey walls, pressured daily to renounce his Protestant faith and convert to Catholicism. Eventually, de Moivre fled to England, where he arrived as a refugee with little more than his mathematical knowledge and an unshakable determination to succeed. In London, he eked out a living as a private mathematics tutor, traveling from one pupil's home to another through the winding streets of the city. During these walks between lessons, de Moivre carried with him torn pages from Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, which he had carefully removed from his own copy so he could study them during his travels. This dedication to learning, this hunger for knowledge despite his difficult circumstances, would eventually establish him as one of the leading mathematicians of his era. He became a Fellow of the Royal Society and corresponded with the greatest scientific minds of his time, yet financial security always eluded him. Despite his impressive contributions to mathematics, including pioneering work on the normal distribution and probability theory, de Moivre could never secure a permanent university position, partly due to persistent prejudice against his French origins. He spent his entire adult life in relative poverty, teaching students and playing chess for small amounts of money in London's coffee houses. As de Moivre aged, his body began to betray him in a most peculiar way. He noticed that each night he required more sleep than the night before, not dramatically more, but 15 minutes extra each evening. For a mathematician whose entire life had been devoted to patterns, numbers, and calculations, this observation became more than just a curiosity. It became a puzzle to solve. De Moivre began meticulously tracking his sleeping patterns, noting with scientific precision how each night saw him slumbering an additional quarter of an hour longer than the previous one. His mathematical mind immediately recognized this as an arithmetic progression, and being a mathematician who had spent decades calculating probabilities and studying sequences, he couldn't resist taking the pattern to its logical conclusion. If he was sleeping 15 minutes longer each night, he reasoned, then eventually he would sleep for a full 24 hours. And when that day came, when he finally slept for an entire day and night without waking, he would not wake at all. Death, he calculated, would come when his need for sleep consumed all his waking hours. Using his expertise in arithmetic progressions, de Moivre performed the calculation. Starting from his then current sleep requirements of approximately 20 hours per day, he determined that the day of perpetual sleep, the day he would die, would be November 27th, 1754. As the date approached, whether de Moivre felt fear or acceptance remains unknown to us. What we do know is that he had spent a lifetime studying probability, understanding that some patterns, once set in motion, reach their inevitable conclusions. On November 27, 1754, Abraham de Moivre did not rise from his bed. His prediction proved accurate. He died on the exact day his calculations had foretold. His cause of death recorded simply as somnolence, excessive sleepiness. Whether his death was purely physiological, the natural end of a frail elderly man, or whether his own prediction became a self-fulfilling prophecy, remains one of history's unsettling mysteries. Some historians have questioned the veracity of this story, noting that contemporary biographies written shortly after his death make no mention of this prediction. Yet the tale has persisted for centuries, passed down through mathematical circles as either a remarkable coincidence or proof that some patterns in life are as calculable as any equation. The world of the 18th century was filled with men who straddled the line between science and mysticism, but few walked that line quite like Emanuel Swedenborg. Born in Stockholm on January 29, 1688, Swedenborg began his life as a man of rigorous scientific inquiry. His father, Jesper Swedenborg, was a prominent Lutheran bishop, and young Emanuel received an excellent education at Uppsala University before embarking on a grand tour of Europe that would last over 5 years. During his travels, he studied under some of the greatest scientific minds of the age, including Isaac Newton and Edmund Halley in England. When he returned to Sweden, Swedenborg threw himself into practical scientific work, becoming an assessor at the Royal College of Mines, a position he would hold for decades. His contributions during this period were impressive and varied. He published Sweden's first scientific journal, designed various mechanical devices, including plans for a submarine and an aircraft, and wrote extensively on topics ranging from metallurgy to anatomy. He was, by all accounts, a rational man of the Enlightenment, someone who believed that the universe could be understood through observation and reason. But in 1741, when Swedenborg was 53 years old, something shifted within him. He began experiencing vivid dreams and visions that he could not explain through scientific inquiry. These experiences culminated on Easter weekend of 1744, when Swedenborg claimed to have received a divine revelation. According to his account, Jesus Christ himself appeared to him and appointed him to write a new doctrine that would reform Christianity. From that moment forward, Swedenborg's spiritual senses were opened, allowing him to freely visit heaven and hell and converse with angels, demons, and other spirits. For the remaining decades of his life, Swedenborg led a double existence. By day, he continued his work in the Swedish government, serving as a respected member of the House of Nobles and publishing papers on financial and economic matters. But he also spent these years writing prolifically about his spiritual experiences, producing over 30 volumes of theological works, all written in Latin and published anonymously in London and Amsterdam, where greater intellectual and religious freedom existed than in Sweden. His writings described in elaborate detail the structure of heaven and hell, the nature of the afterlife, and a complex system he called the doctrine of correspondences, which held that everything in the physical world was merely a reflection of spiritual realities. Despite the seemingly impossible nature of his claims, Swedenborg gained fame for several instances of apparent clairvoyance that could not be easily explained away. Perhaps the most famous occurred in July 1759, when Swedenborg was attending a party in Gothenburg, approximately 250 miles from Stockholm. In the middle of the gathering, he suddenly became agitated and announced that a massive fire had broken out in Stockholm. He described the fire's progress in real time, explaining how it was spreading rapidly through the eastern district of the city. He told the assembled guests that the fire had consumed a friend's house and was now threatening his brother's residence on Hornsgatan, but that it had been extinguished just 3 doors away from his own property. 2 days later, a messenger arrived from Stockholm confirming every detail of Swedenborg's description, including the precise location where the fire had stopped. Multiple witnesses, including the governor of Gothenburg, corroborated the account. In December 1771, while in London for what would be his final visit to the city, Swedenborg suffered a stroke. Though he partially recovered, he seemed to sense that his earthly journey was coming to an end. In February 1772, he received a letter from John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, requesting a meeting. Wesley suggested they meet in 6 months when he returned from a journey. Swedenborg's reply was polite but firm. A meeting in 6 months would be impossible, he wrote, because he would be departing to the spiritual world for the last time on March 29th. He had paid his rent to his landlord through that date. As March approached, Swedenborg's health continued to decline, but he remained certain of his prediction. His landlord's servant, Elizabeth Reynolds, later recounted that Swedenborg spoke of his approaching death with joy, as though he were planning a holiday or attending a celebration. On March 29, 1772, those caring for Swedenborg watched the clock anxiously. As the afternoon wore on and evening approached, he lay in bed, appearing weak but at peace. When a pastor came to visit him that afternoon, Swedenborg raised himself slightly and spoke with clarity and conviction about the truth of everything he had written. He died that afternoon, just as he had predicted, at the age of 84. Unlike de Moivre's mathematical calculation, Swedenborg's predictions seemed to stem from his claimed ability to perceive spiritual realities that remained hidden from others. Whether one believes he truly conversed with angels and foresaw his death through divine knowledge, or whether his prediction was mere coincidence, cannot diminish the uncanny accuracy with which he foretold the exact date of his departure from this world. Among American literary giants, few names shine as brightly as Samuel Langhorne Clemens, better known by his pen name, Mark Twain. Born on November 30th, 1835, in the small town of Florida, Missouri, Twain would go on to become one of the most celebrated authors in American history, crafting works like The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn that would define American literature for generations. But Twain's birth was marked by a celestial phenomenon that would, in his mind, forever link his fate to the heavens. On the very day he was born, Halley's Comet made its closest approach to Earth, blazing across the night sky in a spectacular display that occurs only once every 75 to 76 years. Throughout his life, Twain was known for his sharp wit, his satirical observations of American society, and his ability to find humor in even the darkest circumstances. He traveled extensively, gave lectures that drew enormous crowds, and lived a life filled with both triumph and tragedy. He married Olivia Langdon in 1870, and together they had 4 children, though the death of his son Langdon at just 19 months old would be the first of many losses that would mark Twain's later years. His daughter Susie died of meningitis in 1896, and his wife Olivia passed away in 1904. By the time Twain reached his 70s, he had experienced more than his share of grief, and he often wrote about death with a mixture of humor and melancholy that seemed to suggest he had made peace with his own mortality. In 1909, as Halley's Comet began its return journey toward Earth, Twain made a prediction that seemed to capture perfectly his sense of cosmic irony. He told friends and colleagues that he had come into this world with Halley's Comet, and he fully expected to go out with it. The statement had the ring of one of his famous quips, the kind of thing Twain might say for a dramatic effect or to amuse his audience. But there was something in the way he said it that suggested he truly believed it. He phrased it as though it were a matter of destiny rather than speculation, saying that the Almighty had surely decided that these two unaccountable freaks, Twain and the Comet, had come in together and must therefore go out together. As 1910 arrived and Halley's Comet grew brighter in the night sky, approaching its closest point to Earth, Twain's health began to fail. He had been suffering from angina pectoris, a form of chest pain caused by reduced blood flow to the heart, and his condition steadily worsened. On April 20th, 1910, Halley's Comet reached its perihelion, the point in its orbit closest to the Sun, making it visible as a spectacular sight in Earth's skies. The following day, April 21st, Mark Twain suffered a heart attack and died at his home in Redding, Connecticut. He was 74 years old. Just as he had predicted, he had come in with Halley's Comet and gone out with it, bookending his life with the cosmic visitor that appears only once in a human lifetime. The coincidence seemed too perfect, too poetic, to be merely random chance. Yet science offers no mechanism by which a comet millions of miles away could influence the exact timing of a man's death. Whether Twain's prediction was the result of an uncanny intuition, a self-fulfilling prophecy driven by his belief in this cosmic connection, or simply one of those strange coincidences that pepper human history, remains open to interpretation. What cannot be disputed is that America's greatest humorist died exactly when he said he would, his exit timed perfectly with the celestial phenomenon that had marked his entrance into the world. On a November evening in 2012, a radio host named Frank Pastore sat in the studio of KKLA, a Christian talk radio station in Glendale, California, discussing philosophy, faith, and the nature of existence with his listeners. Pastore had lived a remarkable life. Born in 1957, he had achieved his childhood dream of becoming a Major League Baseball player, pitching for the Cincinnati Reds from 1979 to 1985, and later for the Minnesota Twins. His best season came in 1980 when he posted a 13-7 win-loss record with an earned run average of just over 3. But a line drive that struck his throwing arm in 1984 effectively ended his career. The injury never fully healed, and after a brief stint in the minor leagues, Pastore retired from baseball. Rather than letting this disappointment define him, Pastore reinvented himself. He pursued education with fervor, earning a master's degree in philosophy from Biola University and eventually becoming one of the most popular Christian talk radio hosts in America. His show, which aired weekday afternoons, tackled complex topics ranging from theology and philosophy to politics and current events, all filtered through his Christian worldview. Listeners appreciated his intelligence, his humor, and his willingness to engage with difficult questions. He had been hosting his show for nearly a decade, and on this particular November evening, November 19th, 2012, he was discussing an episode of Through the Wormhole, a science documentary series hosted by Morgan Freeman that explored questions about consciousness and the possibility of life after death. During the discussion, Pastore wanted to illustrate a point about the distinction between body and soul, about how our physical forms are merely temporary vessels for something eternal. He turned to a personal example that his regular listeners would understand. He mentioned that they all knew he rode a motorcycle, that he commuted to and from the studio on his Honda VTX 1800. Then he said something that would later send chills down the spines of everyone who heard the recording. He talked about how, at any moment, especially with the careless drivers who crossed into the carpool lane without signaling, he could be spread all over the 210 freeway. But that wouldn't be him, he emphasized. That would just be his body parts. His soul, his true self, would live on. It was the kind of hypothetical scenario many people use to illustrate philosophical points, the type of thought experiment that feels safely abstract when you're speaking about it in a radio studio. The show ended at 7 in the evening, and Pastore climbed onto his motorcycle to begin his commute home, just as he did every weekday. At around 7:30, as he rode in the carpool lane of the 210 freeway near Duarte, a car in the adjacent lane suddenly swerved into his lane. There was no time to react, no space to maneuver. The Hyundai Sonata struck Pastore's motorcycle, sending him crashing to the pavement. He suffered catastrophic head injuries in the collision. Emergency responders rushed him to Los Angeles County USC Medical Center, where doctors fought to save his life, but the damage was too severe. Pastore never regained consciousness. He remained in a coma for nearly a month before being transferred to a hospital closer to his home in Upland. On December 17, 2012, almost exactly 4 weeks after the accident, Frank Pastore died. He was 55 years old. The California Highway Patrol investigated the crash and determined it was a tragic accident, nothing more. The driver who struck him was neither arrested nor cited, simply another person who made a careless lane change without realizing someone was there. But for everyone who had heard Pastore's final broadcast, for the thousands of listeners who had tuned in that November evening, the timing was almost unbearable to contemplate. 3 hours before the crash, he had described almost exactly what would happen to him. He had even mentioned the specific freeway, the 210, where his body parts could be scattered. Was it a premonition? Some subconscious awareness that his time was running short? Or was it simply the cruelest of coincidences that a man's hypothetical example of sudden death would become his reality before the day ended? If you had met Arnold Schoenberg at any point in his adult life and asked him about the number 13, you would have seen genuine fear flicker across his face. The Austrian composer, born on September 13, 1874, suffered from triskaidekaphobia, an intense and debilitating fear of the number 13 that governed many of his daily decisions and haunted him throughout his life. Schoenberg was one of the most revolutionary and influential composers of the 20th century, a musical theorist who fundamentally transformed how we think about harmony and composition. He pioneered 12-tone technique, a method of composition that treated all 12 notes of the chromatic scale with equal importance, breaking free from the traditional rules of tonality that had governed Western music for centuries. His innovations were controversial and groundbreaking in equal measure. When the Nazis came to power in Germany, they labeled his music as degenerate art, forcing Schoenberg, who was Jewish by birth, though he had converted to Christianity decades earlier, to flee Europe for America in 1933. He settled in Los Angeles, where he taught at UCLA and USC, continuing to compose and refine his revolutionary musical theories. But throughout all his achievements, throughout his flights from persecution and his battles to have his music accepted by a skeptical public, the number 13 remained his constant tormentor. He avoided rooms, floors, and buildings that had the number 13 associated with them. He refused to rent a house that was located at 13 Pine Street, despite it otherwise meeting his needs perfectly. This was not a casual superstition or a quirky preference. For Schoenberg, the fear was all-consuming, a central pillar of his belief system. His musical manuscripts reveal the depth of his obsession. In his early works, measure numbers proceeded normally, but after composing the 13th song of his cycle, the Book of the Hanging Gardens, he began substituting the number 13 with 12a in all his measure counts. Even his opera Moses und Aaron bears the mark of his phobia. The biblical spelling is Aaron with 2 a's, but Schoenberg deliberately misspelled it with a single a because Moses and Aaron spelled correctly would have been 13 letters long. He could not bear to have a title of 13 letters, so he changed the spelling to avoid this terrifying number. Friends and family members were well aware of his fear, though most viewed it with a mixture of concern and bemusement. Schoenberg himself seemed to believe that being born on the 13th of the month marked him for some special relationship with this number, though whether he saw it as a curse or simply an inescapable destiny is unclear. In 1950, as Schoenberg approached his 76th birthday, a friend sent him a letter. It was meant as a joke, the kind of teasing observation that friends sometimes make. The friend pointed out that 7 plus 6 equals 13, and therefore Schoenberg's 76th year would be a year ruled by the number he feared most. Rather than laughing off this observation, Schoenberg was horrified. According to those close to him, the letter stunned and deeply depressed him. Until that moment, he had feared years that were multiples of 13, 13th, 26th, 39th years, and so on. But he had never considered that the digits of his age might add up to 13. Now that this possibility had been pointed out to him, he could not escape it. The year stretched before him like a shadow, each day bringing him closer to some unavoidable fate. Friday, July 13th, 1951, arrived. Schoenberg spent the entire day in bed, sick not just with physical ailments, but with overwhelming anxiety and dread. It was Friday the 13th, and he was in his 76th year. The convergence of these factors was too much for him to bear. His wife, Gertrude, watched over him throughout the day, concerned about his declining health, but perhaps also hoping that when midnight passed and the 14th arrived, her husband's anxiety would finally ease. As the evening wore on, she found herself watching the clock. According to her later accounts, at around 11:45 that night, just 15 minutes before midnight, she looked at the clock and thought to herself that in just a little while, the worst would be over. Her husband would have survived Friday the 13th, and the fear that had gripped him could finally release its hold. But then the doctor called her to her husband's bedside. Arnold Schoenberg's throat rattled twice. His heart gave one powerful beat, and then nothing. He died at 11:45, 15 minutes before midnight, unable or unwilling to face even the final 13 minutes of Friday the 13th. His fear of the number 13 had dominated his life, shaped his art, and in the end, perhaps even determined the moment of his death. Whether the stress and anxiety he experienced hastened his physical decline, or whether his death at that specific time was pure coincidence, remains impossible to determine. What we know is that one of the 20th century's most brilliant musical minds died exactly as his deepest fear had always suggested he would, on a day marked by the number that had haunted him since birth. The evening of April 3rd, 1968, was stormy in Memphis, Tennessee. Rain lashed against the windows of the Mason Temple, and thunder rumbled through the night sky. Inside the church, several thousand people had gathered, many of them sanitation workers and their supporters who had come to hear Martin Luther King Jr. speak. King had come to Memphis to support a strike by the city's predominantly African-American sanitation workers who were protesting poverty wages, dangerous working conditions, and the institutional racism that treated them as less than human. The strike had been sparked by a tragic incident in February when two sanitation workers, Eckel Cole and Robert Walker, had taken shelter from the rain inside the compactor compartment of their garbage truck. The machinery malfunctioned, crushing them to death. King's involvement in Memphis was part of his broader Poor People's Campaign, an effort to address economic inequality across all racial lines. But the city had proven to be a difficult battleground. An earlier march King had led on March 28th had descended into violence when some young protesters smashed windows, giving the police an excuse for a brutal crackdown. One teenager, Larry Payne, had been shot and killed by police. The incident had shaken King deeply and damaged the reputation of his nonviolent movement. He had vowed to return to Memphis to lead a peaceful march, despite warnings from his staff and despite the very real threats against his life. That evening, King had been exhausted and ill, suffering from a sore throat and fever. He had asked his friend and colleague Ralph Abernathy to speak in his place, but when Abernathy arrived at the Mason Temple and saw the crowd's disappointment, he called King at the hotel and convinced him to come speak. When King arrived and took the podium, he delivered what would become known as the Mountaintop speech, a powerful and rambling address that touched on history, justice, economic inequality, and faith. He spoke for nearly an hour, his voice rising and falling with the thunder outside, his words carrying both urgency and a strange, haunting sense of finality. For much of the speech, he discussed practical matters, the need for economic boycotts, the importance of unity among the workers, the justice of their cause. He drew on biblical imagery, comparing the sanitation workers to the enslaved Israelites under Pharaoh, comparing Memphis to ancient Egypt. He told the parable of the Good Samaritan, urging his listeners to help those in need regardless of the personal cost. But as the speech drew toward its conclusion, King's tone shifted. He began talking about his own mortality in a way that those who knew him found deeply unsettling. He mentioned that there had been a bomb threat on his flight from Atlanta that morning, that the plane had been delayed while authorities searched it. He talked about all the death threats he had received over the years, the constant awareness that someone might try to kill him. Then he said something remarkable. He said that he had been stabbed years earlier in Harlem, and if he had sneezed during a certain moment after that stabbing, he would have died. And if he had died then, he wouldn't have been around to see the sit-ins of 1960, or the freedom rides of 1961, or the March on Washington in 1963, where he delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. He listed all the moments of the civil rights movement he would have missed if he had died earlier, each repetition of "if I had sneezed" building in power and emotion. Then he turned to the present moment and the future. He said that he didn't know what would happen in the days ahead, that there were difficult days ahead. But he wanted his audience to know that it didn't matter to him anymore, because he had been to the mountaintop. Like Moses in the biblical story, he had seen the promised land. He might not get there with them, he said, his voice breaking with emotion. But they, as a people, would get to the promised land. And so he was happy tonight, not worried about anything, not fearing any man, because his eyes had seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. The crowd erupted in applause, deeply moved by what they had heard. Many of them felt elevated, inspired, ready to continue the struggle. But those closest to King had seen something else in his eyes, heard something in his voice that troubled them. It felt like a goodbye. The next day, April 4th, as evening approached, King stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, preparing to go to dinner. He was in good spirits, joking with his friends and colleagues below. At 6:01 in the evening, a single rifle shot rang out. James Earl Ray had been waiting across the street with a Remington 760 rifle. The bullet struck King in the jaw and neck, severing his spinal cord and causing catastrophic damage. He was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, where doctors worked desperately to save him, but the injuries were too severe. At 7:05 that evening, Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead. He was 39 years old. The speech he had given the night before, with its prophetic references to not reaching the promised land, to having seen the mountaintop, took on a haunting new significance. Had King somehow known what was coming? Had the constant threats, the bomb scare that morning, the awareness that many powerful people wanted him dead, given him some intuitive sense that his time was short? Or had he simply been speaking metaphorically about the risks every civil rights worker faced, using Moses as a literary device to inspire his audience, never imagining that he would be murdered within 24 hours? Scholars debate whether the Mountaintop speech should be interpreted as a genuine premonition, or whether its prophetic quality is largely a product of our knowledge of what came next, our tendency to read meaning backward from tragedy. What remains undeniable is that King's final public words seem to anticipate his death with an accuracy that continues to send chills down the spines of those who hear them. The world of music, particularly rock and rap, seems to hold a disproportionate number of artists who predicted their own deaths through their lyrics, their interviews, or their statements to friends. Perhaps it's the nature of their art, the way musicians often channel their deepest fears and intuitions into their work, that makes these predictions feel so eerie in retrospect. Or perhaps it's simply that their words are recorded, preserved, and endlessly analyzed, making patterns visible that would be forgotten in ordinary lives. Tupac Shakur, one of the most talented and controversial rappers of the 1990s, spoke about his death multiple times before it happened. In his lyrics, he frequently referenced dying young and violently, and in interviews he seemed almost resigned to an early death. In one song released just months before he was killed, he rapped, "I've been shot and murdered, can tell you how it happened word for word." At the time, listeners might have thought it was just the violent imagery that permeated gangsta rap, the performative tough guy persona that was part of the genre's appeal. But on September 7th, 1996, while leaving a Mike Tyson boxing match in Las Vegas, Tupac was shot multiple times in a drive-by shooting. He died 6 days later at the age of 25. For years, his murder remained unsolved, and no one could definitively say how it happened, word for word. The case seemed to vindicate not just his prediction of being shot and murdered, but even the specific detail about the circumstances remaining mysterious. Kurt Cobain, the lead singer of Nirvana, reportedly told a classmate when he was just 14 years old that he would become a rich and famous rock star and that he would die in a blaze of glory like Jimi Hendrix. This story is difficult to verify with absolute certainty, as it relies on second-hand accounts from people who knew Cobain in his teenage years. But multiple sources have repeated the tale, and it has become part of the Cobain mythology. What we know for certain is that Cobain did become one of the most famous rock musicians of his generation. Nirvana's album Nevermind, released in 1991, transformed the music industry and made Cobain an unlikely and deeply uncomfortable spokesperson for a generation. He struggled with heroin addiction, chronic pain, and depression, and his relationship with fame was deeply troubled. On April 5, 1994, Cobain was found dead in his Seattle home. He had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, likely several days earlier. He was 27 years old, joining Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, and others in the infamous 27 Club of musicians who died at that specific age. Whether his teenage prediction had been genuine foresight, whether it had shaped his self-destructive behavior in some subconscious way, or whether it was merely a tragic coincidence remains unknowable. But the fact that he achieved both parts of his prediction, the fame and the early death, cannot be denied. Ronnie Van Zant, the lead singer and primary songwriter for the southern rock band Lynyrd Skynyrd, told multiple people over the course of several years that he would not live to see his 30th birthday. He said he would die with his boots on, meaning he would die suddenly, violently, still in the middle of his active life, rather than in old age. His bandmates remember him saying this repeatedly, almost obsessively, to the point where it became a dark, running joke among the group. They didn't take it seriously. Van Zant was in his 20s, full of energy and talent, leading one of the most successful rock bands in America. Songs like Sweet Home Alabama and Free Bird had made them legends. Why would he die young? On October 20th, 1977, Lynyrd Skynyrd was traveling to a concert in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. They were flying in a chartered Convair 240 aircraft that had a history of mechanical problems. The plane ran out of fuel mid-flight and crashed in a wooded area near Gillsburg, Mississippi. Ronnie Van Zant died on impact, along with guitarist Steve Gaines and backup singer Cassie Gaines. Van Zant was 29 years old, less than 3 months short of his 30th birthday. His prediction had been eerily, tragically accurate. He had indeed died with his boots on, in the middle of his career, still young, just as he had always said he would. Beyond these famous musicians, other cases of predicted deaths dot the historical record, each one unsettling in its own way. Mikey Welsh, the bassist for the alternative rock band Weezer, had struggled with mental health issues and addiction throughout his life. In October 2011, he posted a message on Twitter that seemed both mundane and deeply disturbing. He wrote that he had dreamed he died in Chicago the weekend after next, specifically of a heart attack in his sleep. He added that he needed to write his will today. At the time, some of his followers expressed concern, while others probably assumed it was just a dark joke or the kind of morbid thought many people have occasionally. 2 weeks later, Welsh was found dead in his hotel room in Chicago. The exact timing matched his tweet perfectly. The cause of death was determined to be a heart attack brought on by a drug overdose, and all indications were that he died in his sleep, again matching precisely what he had predicted. Whether his tweet was a genuine premonition, whether it was a coded suicide note from someone who had already decided to end his life, or whether it was a bizarre coincidence remains unclear. What is clear is that Welsh predicted not just his death, but the location, the timing, and the cause with uncanny accuracy. Pete Maravich, known as Pistol Pete, was one of the greatest basketball players in NBA history. Playing in the 1970s for teams including the Atlanta Hawks and the New Orleans Jazz, Maravich was known for his incredible ball-handling skills and creative playmaking. In 1974, during an interview with the Beaver County Times in Pennsylvania, Maravich made an offhand comment about his career and future. He said he didn't want to play 10 years in the NBA and then die of a heart attack when he was 40. It seemed like a random statement, the kind of thing athletes say when thinking about life after sports and the importance of staying healthy. Maravich did play 10 years in the NBA, retiring in 1980. On January 5, 1988, 6 months into his 40th year, he collapsed while playing a pickup basketball game in Pasadena, California. He died almost instantly of a massive heart attack. Medical examination later revealed that Maravich had been born with a rare congenital defect. He was missing his left coronary artery, a condition that is usually fatal in infancy or early childhood. The fact that he had survived to adulthood, let alone become a professional athlete, was remarkable. That he had lived to exactly the age and died in exactly the manner he had predicted 14 years earlier seemed to defy the laws of probability. Finally, there is the case of Princess Diana, whose death in a car crash in Paris on August 31, 1997, shocked the world. In a letter written to her legal advisor, Victor Mishkon, in 1995, Diana made a chilling prediction. She wrote that reliable sources had warned her that someone was planning to stage a car accident that would either kill her or seriously injure her. The letter, which came to be known as the Mishkon Note, was not made public until years after her death. When it finally surfaced, it added fuel to the conspiracy theories that her death had not been an accident, but rather an assassination made to look like a crash. Official investigations concluded that Diana's death was indeed an accident, caused by the reckless driving of her chauffeur, Henri Paul, who was intoxicated and fleeing paparazzi at high speeds. But the existence of Diana's letter, her specific prediction of death by staged car accident, remains one of the most disturbing elements of the entire tragedy. Did she have genuine knowledge of a plot against her life? Was she struggling with paranoia brought on by the intense scrutiny and pressure she faced? Or was it simply a horrible coincidence that her fear of a staged car accident came true, even if the actual circumstances were different from what she had imagined? These stories, separated by centuries and continents, by different cultures and circumstances, all share a common thread. They are tales of people who looked ahead into the uncertain future and saw, with varying degrees of clarity, the outline of their own deaths. Some made mathematical calculations. Others experienced visions or spoke words that seemed prophetic only in hindsight. A few simply felt with unshakable certainty that their time was limited, that death was approaching sooner than their years might suggest. Skeptics will argue that these are merely coincidences, that humans make thousands of predictions and only remember the ones that come true, that we read significance into patterns that mean nothing. And perhaps they're right. Perhaps Abraham de Moivre's death on his calculated date was simply the end point of a natural physical decline. Perhaps Emanuel Swedenborg died when he predicted because his failing health made it obvious his time was near. Perhaps Mark Twain's timing with Halley's Comet was pure astronomical chance, no more meaningful than any other death that happens to coincide with a notable event. Perhaps Frank Pastore's statement about being spread across the freeway was just an unfortunate example used hours before a random accident. Perhaps Arnold Schoenberg's anxiety about Friday the 13th created such stress that it triggered a heart attack that might have happened on any day. Perhaps Martin Luther King's Mountaintop speech was simply powerful rhetoric that only seems prophetic because we know what happened the next day. Perhaps all the musicians who predicted their deaths were simply creating dark imagery that happened to match reality through sheer probability. But then again, perhaps not. Perhaps there are moments when the veil between present and future grows thin, when some people can perceive patterns that remain invisible to others, when intuition or calculation or divine knowledge allows a glimpse of what is to come. Perhaps death, for all its seeming randomness, follows patterns we don't yet understand. Perhaps consciousness itself, that most mysterious of phenomena, has capacities we have not yet mapped. Or perhaps these stories persist not because they reveal any objective truth about prediction and fate, but because they speak to something deep in the human psyche. Our desire to believe that death is not completely arbitrary, that it might be knowable, that we might have some agency or awareness even in our final moments. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the unexplained, please consider subscribing to Unexplained Mysteries for Sleep and hitting the like button. Your support helps us continue bringing you these fascinating stories that exist in the strange space between the known and the unknown, between coincidence and destiny, between the explicable and the mysterious. Sleep well, and remember that some questions have no comfortable answers,